Good morning, everybody, and welcome to your Tuesday. We are working on why location matters in economic geography right now. Yesterday, introduced you to least cost theory, also known as the Weber model. And now, what we're going to be doing is looking at how that sort of applies in the real world to specifically what we call situational factors. And generally speaking, when we're talking about the cost that a company faces in terms of situational factors, we're talking here about transportation. Now, one objective of every company is to minimize the cost of transporting inputs, right? Inputs are also known as, probably better known to you as raw material. So the objective of every company is to minimize the cost of transporting raw material, transporting imports to the factory, and also minimizing the cost of transporting finished products from the plant, the factory, to the market, right, to consumers. This is something that we discussed yesterday when we introduced least cost theory, right? That there's two parts of every journey, right? And those are the two major parts of the journey of a manufactured product. Now, we did mention yesterday that where a company situates itself in relation to raw material in the market really depends on the product itself. And a lot of cases, as far as transportation is concerned, if transportation cost is going to be the biggest concern, that's going to depend on the industry itself. For some manufacturers, yes, minimizing transportation cost is the most critical factor in determining where to locate a factory. Now, the optimal plant location is going to be as close as possible to inputs, as close as possible to the raw material, if and only if the cost of transporting raw materials to the factory is greater than the cost of transporting the finished product to consumers. I'm going to repeat that. It's really important. You want to put yourself as close to the raw material as possible if the cost of transporting the raw material to the factory is going to be a lot more than the cost of bringing the finished product to the consumer. Now, and what type of business would this be the case? Well, this would be the case if the industry is known as what we call a bulk reducing industry or a weight losing industry. You have to understand that anytime that something is shipped, the biggest cost factor is going to be the weight of the product itself being shipped. So in a bulk reducing industry or a weight losing industry in which inputs weigh more than the final product, which the raw material is heavier than the finished good, if you're going to minimize transportation costs, you want to locate yourself close to inputs. Okay, so what would be some examples of this? Well, a great example of this that I can share with you is the example of copper. Okay. Generally speaking, one of the major uses of copper in the United States is for copper wire. Yeah. But when you mine copper, obviously, it doesn't come in that form, right? It comes in the form that you see on the top left there. That's copper ore. Now, copper ore is pretty heavy and it's mostly junk. Most copper ore is very low grade and less than 0.6 copper or 0.6% copper. The rest of it is waste. Okay, it's mostly junk ore. The weight, though, and bulk of copper ore is considerable. The next step is to concentrate the copper, make it about 25% copper, right? And in terms of, creating something more concentrating. And so this is bulk reducing. Concentration mills have to be near mines. Smelters will remove the impurities from copper, and then purified copper is further treated at other refineries until you end up with something that's about 99.99% pure copper. Of course, you want to be as close to the mines as possible in this case, because the most expensive part of the journey is going to be from mining the copper to bring in it to whatever refining facility, because that is a very heavy product. Okay, bulk reducing industry. Steel making is another great example of a bulk reducing industry that traditionally locates itself near inputs. Steel is basically an alloy of iron, right? That's manufactured by removing the impurities of iron, right? So when you think about where your historical location of the steel industry is, and even steel mills now, they usually are situated somewhere between the actual iron ore and coal deposits, right? That's used for the actual steel making process. Now, I don't think we want to get into this just yet. We'll come back to that a little bit later as to why I've got these couple of maps. But the lost my train of thought there for a second. On the opposite end, or alternatively, the optimal plant location is as close as possible to the customer, as close as possible to the market, if the cost of transporting raw materials to the factory is less than the cost of transporting the product to consumers. If the most expensive part of the journey is from factory to consumer, then you want to be as close to your market or your consumer as possible. So this would be the case if the industry is what we call a bulk gaining industry or a weight gaining industry, in which something gains volume or weight during production. To minimize transportation costs, one needs to locate near where the product is sold. For example, fabricated metals, right? A fabricated metal factory brings together metals from previously manufactured parts as the main inputs and transforms them into a more complex product. So common examples of fabricated metals, televisions, refrigerators, air conditioners, farm machinery, obviously cars, like what you see here on the board. Most motor vehicle production takes place near markets. I don't know if you guys realize this, but 27% of all auto sales in the United States, or sorry, all auto sales in the world happen in China. 22% of auto sales happens in the rest of Asia. Only 23% of auto sales in the world happens in North America, and that would include Mexico. Only 7% in Europe. So most cars produced in those places, or sorry, most cars are produced in those locations, in China, in the rest of Asia, in North America, and in Europe. That's where most cars are going to be produced if you're looking at the map, because that's the auto industry is a bulk gaining industry. 80% of the cars, for example, sold in North America are produced in North America. Take a look at this vehicle production grid for the Toyota company, 2016, 2017. Generally, when you think about Toyota, you think about a Japanese car. And while Toyota is a Japanese brand, notice that if you buy a Toyota Camry or a Toyota Corolla or a Toyota Tundra or Tacoma, notice the locations that they're being produced for the American market. They're being produced in Kentucky, in Mississippi, in Texas, in California, in Mexico, in West Virginia, in Alabama. This is where your Toyotas are being produced, or because, or I should say, these are where your Toyotas are being produced for American markets, because cars are a bulk gaining industry. You don't want to actually like build the car in Japan and then ship it overseas to the United States. That just doesn't make a lot of financial sense. And so that's the way that this goes. Little known fact, I think a lot of people think that when they're driving a Japanese brand or a German brand, that's where the car was made, and that is definitely not where the car was made in most cases, right? You want to be closest to your markets. Beverage production is another great example of a bulk gaining industry. Coca-Cola might be headquartered in Atlanta, but it has bottling plants all over the world. Empty cans, empty bottles get brought to the bottler, and then filled with soft drink or whatever other beverage, and then shipped to consumers, right? I don't know if you've noticed it before, but your Coca-Cola products are largely going to be bottled right here in Marietta, right by the Walker School on Cobb Parkway. That's where the Coca-Cola bottling plant is here. You want to be close to your market because water is heavy, it's expensive to transport, and so what you want to do is you want to add water on the manufacturing site along with syrup or hops if it's the beer industry, which are light and easy to transport. And since shipping filled containers is more expensive than shipping empty ones, you want to be as close to the market as possible, right? That's the idea anyway. The other type of industry that you would want to be close to market are known as single market manufacturers. These are going to be specialized manufacturers with only like one or two customers. And so if you only have one or two customers, you want to be in very, very close proximity to that customer. Zippers are a great example of this, right? If you're wearing anything right now with a zipper, and if you look at the zipper, it'll probably say YKK on it. YKK is the biggest zipper producer in the world, and so YKK is usually going to establish its factories, its zipper factories, near textile manufacturers, right? Because that's its customer, right? You don't buy zippers from YKK. YKK's customer is going to be, whatever companies producing blue jeans, for example, right? That's the idea. The major motor vehicle parts makers, their customers are largely the automobile manufacturers. And so they want to basically be as close as possible to those manufacturers. If you look at this map here, all of the black stars are automobile assembly plants. It's called Automobile Alley is what we call this area of the United States. And if you look at the red dots, these are where part suppliers are located. And you'll notice that the majority of those part suppliers are located closest to their customers, right? The automobile manufacturers. So that's important to know as well. Proximity to the assembly plant is important for parts producers because of what we call just-in-time delivery. Just-in-time delivery is the idea that parts are delivered to be used immediately rather than having to store them up for weeks. So if you are delivering for when they're immediately used, you want to be as close to the final assembly plants as possible. Perishable products also are an important situational factor here, right? Where you want to be close to market. To deliver your products to consumers as rapidly as possible, perishable product industries need to be located near their markets. Perhaps you remember the idea of the milk shed from agricultural geography, right? Perishable products like dairy, you want to be, aside from dairy being, in the form of milk, really heavy, you also want to be as close as possible to your market for the purpose of getting it there before it expires. Speaking of expiration, this portion of the lesson for today expires in about 55 seconds, and I need a bit more than 55 seconds to wrap this up. So I'm going to end part one here, and then we'll record part two.